The morning sun was already burning hot when Amara felt the rough hands push her up onto the wooden platform. Her bare feet touched the splintered boards that had held so many others before her. The crowd below looked up at her like she was nothing more than a horse or a piece of furniture they might buy. "Look at this fine specimen," the auctioneer called out, his voice cutting through the humid Charleston air. "Strong arms, good teeth, perfect for fieldwork or house duties." Amara kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look down at the faces staring at her. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made things worse. But inside, her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. The iron shackles around her wrists felt heavier with each passing moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been living freely in Philadelphia with her father, who was a respected minister in their community. She remembered the morning when everything changed. Men had broken into their home before dawn, claiming she was a runaway slave. No amount of papers or proof could save her from their lies and greed. The brand mark on her shoulder still burned. They had done it just yesterday when she tried to run from the holding pen. The hot iron had seared her skin while they held her down. "That'll teach you to know your place," one of the guards had laughed. Now she stood on this block, listening to strangers decide her fate with their bids. $200. Someone shouted from the crowd. "$250, came another voice. Amara closed her eyes for a moment and tried to remember her father's voice reading from his Bible on Sunday mornings. She tried to remember the smell of her mother's cooking and the sound of children playing in the streets of her neighborhood. These memories were all she had left now. 300. The voice was harsh and mean. Amara opened her eyes and saw a tall man with cold gray eyes staring at her. His clothes were expensive, but there was something cruel about the way he smiled. She had heard other people whisper his name, Silas Hartwell. They said he was the worst kind of plantation owner, the kind who enjoyed causing pain. "Going once for 300, the auctioneer called. In the back of the crowd, a man in a black hat watched everything with different eyes. Jake Morrison had come to Charleston for business that had nothing to do with buying people. He was supposed to be gathering information about secret routes that helped slaves escape to freedom, but something about the young woman on the platform caught his attention. Jake had seen many terrible things in his 35 years of life. He had fought in wars, stolen cattle, and done things he wasn't proud of. But there was something about the way this woman held herself that reminded him of his sister Catherine. Catherine had died of fever 5 years ago, and Jake still blamed himself for not being there to help her. The woman on the platform had the same proud way of standing that Catherine used to have, even when things were at their worst. Even with chains on her wrists and a fresh brand on her shoulder, she refused to let them break her spirit. "Going twice," the auctioneer's voice rang out. That's when Jake heard it, so quietly that only someone standing close could catch the words. The woman's lips barely moved as she whispered, "They branded me like an animal, but they cannot brand my soul." Jake felt something twist in his chest. He had heard many people beg and cry from auction blocks, but he had never heard anyone speak with such quiet strength in the face of such horror. "Sold to Mr. Hartwell for $300. The auctioneer's hammer came down with a loud bang. The cruel man with gray eyes smiled as he walked forward to claim his purchase. Jake watched as rough hands grabbed Amara and pulled her down from the platform. She stumbled but did not fall. Even as they loaded her into the back of a wagon with other newly bought people, she kept her head up. Jake found himself following the wagon as it rolled out of Charleston. He told himself he was just curious, that he would watch for a few miles and then get back to his real business. But something kept pulling him forward. The wagon stopped at a farm about 10 miles outside the city. Jake hid behind a hill and watched through his small telescope as the new arrivals were taken to a row of small wooden buildings. These were the slave quarters where people lived packed together like animals. That evening, Jake made camp in the woods near the plantation. He built a small fire and tried to focus on the maps he was supposed to be studying. These maps showed secret paths through swamps and forests that led to freedom in the north. His job was to find new routes that weren't being watched by slave catchers. But his mind kept going back to the woman from the auction block. He wondered if she was getting enough food, if anyone was treating her wounds, if she was planning another escape attempt. As if in answer to his thoughts, Jake heard sounds coming from the plantation. Angry voices and the crack of a whip cut through the night air. He grabbed his telescope and looked toward the slave quarters. What he saw made his blood run cold. They had tied Amara to a wooden post and were taking turns hitting her with a leather whip. Her crime, according to the shouting overseer, was Looking too proud during the evening meal, Jake counted 20 lashes before they finally stopped. Even from his hiding place, he could see the blood on her back. But what amazed him was that she never cried out. Not once did she give them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. When they finally cut her down, she walked back to the quarters on her own 2 feet. She refused help from the other slaves, though Jake could see how much pain she was in. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He stared up at the stars and thought about his sister, Catherine. Before she died, she had made him promise to try to be a better man. "You have good in you, Jake," she had said. "You just need to find a way to use it." Maybe this was his chance. By morning, Jake had made a decision that would change everything. He was going to get that woman out of there no matter what it cost him. He didn't have a plan yet, and he didn't have help, but he knew he couldn't just ride away and pretend he had never seen her. The sun was rising over the plantation as Jake packed up his camp. He had work to do and people to find who might help him. Getting someone out of Silas Hartwell's plantation would be the most dangerous thing he had ever attempted. But as he rode toward Charleston, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Catherine died, he had a purpose that felt bigger than just surviving another day. The woman on the auction block had whispered about being branded, but Jake was beginning to understand that some things, like courage and dignity, could never be burned away. Jake Morrison had never thought of himself as a hero. In fact, most people who knew him would laugh at the idea. He was a man who had made his living on the wrong side of the law for most of his adult life. Cattle rustling, card cheating, and worse things that he tried not to think about too much. After he left the Confederate Army without permission 2 years ago, Jake had been running from one trouble to another. The war had shown him things that no man should see, and he had done things that haunted his dreams. When his commanding officer ordered him to burn down a church full of innocent people, Jake had finally said no. That decision had made him a deserter, but it had also saved what was left of his soul. Now, riding his old horse through the back roads of South Carolina, Jake was supposed to be working for the Underground Railroad. It was honest work for the first time in years, even if it was dangerous. His job was simple: find new escape routes through the swamps and forests that slave catchers hadn't discovered yet. But instead of studying maps and scouting trails, Jake found himself thinking about the woman from the auction block. 3 days had passed since he watched her being sold to Silas Hartwell, and he couldn't get her words out of his head. "They branded me like an animal, but they cannot brand my soul." Jake had seen plenty of people broken by slavery. He had watched strong men reduced to trembling shadows of themselves, but there was something different about this woman. Even with chains on her wrists and fresh wounds on her body, she had refused to let them see her spirit crushed. It reminded him too much of his sister Catherine. Catherine Morrison had been the only good thing in Jake's life growing up. When their parents died of cholera, she was just 16, but she had taken care of Jake like he was her own child. She had worked her fingers to the bone in a textile mill to keep them fed and housed. "Promise me you'll try to be good, Jake," she had said during her final illness. "I know you have kindness in your heart. You just need to find a way to let it out." Jake had promised, but after she died, he had run wild with grief and anger. Every bad choice he made felt like another way of betraying Catherine's memory. Now, camped in the woods near Hartwell's plantation, Jake felt like he might finally have a chance to keep that promise. The plantation was bigger than most, with hundreds of acres of cotton fields and tobacco crops. Jake counted at least 60 slaves working the fields each day. The big white house sat on a hill overlooking everything, like a castle watching over its kingdom. Silas Hartwell was known throughout the region as one of the harshest plantation owners. Other slave owners sometimes criticized him for being too brutal, which was saying something. Jake had heard stories about slaves dying from overwork and punishment at Hartwell's place. For 3 days, Jake watched the daily routine of the plantation through his telescope. The slaves woke before dawn and worked until after sunset. They got 2 meals a day, thin soup and cornbread that barely looked fit for animals. The overseers carried whips and used them freely for the smallest mistakes. Jake saw Amara several times during those 3 days. She was assigned to work in the cotton fields, picking under the burning sun from morning until night. Her movements were careful and precise, like she was trying hard not to give anyone an excuse to punish her again. But Jake could see that she was also watching and learning. She paid attention to the guards' routines, the layout of the buildings, and the gaps in the fence around the plantation. Even while picking cotton, she was planning. On the third night, Jake's worst fears came true. He was eating a cold dinner of jerky and hardtack when he heard shouting from the plantation. Through his telescope, he saw a crowd gathering near the slave quarters. In the center of the crowd, Jake could see Amara being dragged toward the whipping post again. What did she do this time? Jake muttered to himself, adjusting the focus on his telescope. The overseer, a thick man named Bull Patterson, was yelling loud enough for Jake to hear some of his words across the distance. Something about Amara acting too proud and needing to learn her place. It seemed like any excuse would do for these people to cause pain. Jake watched in horror as they tied Amara's hands to the wooden post. Her back was still marked with scars from the beating 3 days ago, but that didn't stop them from raising the whip again. The first lash made Jake flinch like he had been hit himself. The second made him stand up from his hiding place. By the 10th lash, Jake was walking toward his horse without even realizing what he was doing. But what stopped him was seeing Amara herself. Even as the whip cut into her back, she stood straight and tall. She never begged them to stop. She never screamed or cried out in pain. She took every blow with the same quiet dignity she had shown on the auction block. When they finally cut her down, Amara walked back to the slave quarters on her own. Other slaves tried to help her, but she gently refused their assistance. Jake could see her saying something to them, probably telling them not to risk getting in trouble for helping her. That night, Jake barely slept. He kept thinking about his sister's words about having kindness in his heart. He thought about all the bad things he had done in his life and all the good things he had failed to do. Most of all, he thought about courage. Jake had always thought courage meant not being afraid in a fight, or being quick with a gun when trouble started. But watching Amara, he was learning that real courage was something much deeper. It was keeping your dignity when everything else had been taken away. It was protecting others even when you couldn't protect yourself. By the time the sun came up, Jake had made his decision. He was going to get Amara out of that place, whatever it took. He didn't have a plan yet, and he didn't have help, but he knew he couldn't ride away and leave her there. Not when he had the skills and freedom to do something about it. Jake had been many things in his life: a soldier, a deserter, a thief, and a wanderer. But he had never been someone who saved people. The idea scared him more than any gunfight ever had, but maybe that was exactly why he needed to do it. Maybe this was his chance to finally become the kind of man Catherine had believed he could be. As Jake saddled his horse and prepared to ride into Charleston to look for help, he made a silent promise to his sister's memory. This time he wouldn't run away when someone needed him. This time he would find the courage to do the right thing, no matter how dangerous it might be. The woman at the auction block had said they couldn't brand her soul. Jake was starting to understand that maybe his soul didn't have to stay branded by his past mistakes either. Jake knew he couldn't rescue Amara alone. Hartwell's plantation was too well guarded, and Jake was just one man with limited resources. If he was going to have any chance of success, he needed help from someone with money, connections, and knowledge of the Underground Railroad. The problem was that Jake's reputation preceded him wherever he went. Most respectable people crossed the street when they saw him coming. His face was on wanted posters in 3 states, and everyone knew he was a deserter from the Confederate Army. Finding someone willing to trust him would be nearly impossible. But Jake had heard whispers about a wealthy widow in Charleston who secretly funded abolition activities. Rebecca Thornfield was known in polite society as a gracious hostess who threw elegant dinner parties for the city's elite. What most people didn't know was that she used her social connections to gather information and her inherited fortune to help slaves escape to freedom. A meeting with Rebecca would be the most dangerous part of Jake's plan so far. If she turned him into the authorities, he would end up in prison or worse. But he was running out of options, and time was working against him. Every day that Amara remained on Hartwell's plantation was another day she might be killed or sold away to somewhere even worse. Jake spent 2 days watching Rebecca's mansion from different hiding spots around Charleston. The grand White House sat in the middle of the city's most fashionable district, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens and iron gates. Carriages came and went throughout the day, bringing visitors for tea and business meetings. On the 3rd day, Jake finally saw his chance. Rebecca was alone in her garden in the early evening, tending to her rose bushes. The servants were inside preparing dinner and no visitors were expected. Jake slipped over the garden wall and approached her carefully. "Mrs. Thornfield," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. Rebecca looked up from her roses and immediately reached for a small bell that would summon her servants. She was a woman in her 40s with intelligent gray eyes and silver hair, pinned back in an elegant style. Even in her gardening clothes, she carried herself with the confidence of someone used to being in control. "I know who you are, Mr. Morrison," she said calmly. "You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have you arrested." Jake held up his hands to show he wasn't armed. "I need your help to save someone's life." "I'm sure you do," Rebecca replied, still holding the bell. "But why should I risk my reputation and safety to help a known criminal?" "Because there's a woman on Silas Hartwell's plantation who doesn't deserve what's happening to her," Jake said quickly. "She's not even supposed to be a slave. She was kidnapped from Philadelphia and sold here illegally." Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed she lowered the bell slightly. "Even if that's true, what makes you think I can help you?" "I know about your work with the Underground Railroad," Jake said. "I know you've helped other people escape. This woman, she's different. She has courage I've never seen before. If anyone deserves freedom, it's her." "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" Rebecca asked. "Storm Hartwell's plantation with an army?" Jake took a deep breath. This was the moment that would decide everything. "I have a plan, but I need supplies, information, and a safe house. I can get her out, but I need help from someone the community trusts." Rebecca studied Jake's face for a long moment. "You realize that associating with me could get us both killed? Hartwell has friends in the sheriff's office and the state government. If we're caught, they won't just arrest us, they'll make examples of us." "I understand the risks," Jake said, "but I can't walk away and leave her there. I've done too many bad things in my life. Maybe this is my chance to do something good for once." "Tell me about this plan of yours," Rebecca said, finally setting down the bell. Jake quickly outlined his idea. Hartwell's plantation would be hosting a harvest festival in 1 week. It was an annual tradition where neighboring plantation owners and their families came to celebrate the cotton harvest. During the festivities, security would be lighter as guards focused on managing the large crowd of visitors. Jake's plan was to disguise himself as a horse trader and gain access to the plantation during the festival. While everyone was distracted by the celebrations, he would find Amara and help her escape through the swamplands to the north. From there, they would need safe houses and guides to help them reach the Free States. Rebecca listened to the entire plan without interrupting. When Jake finished, she was quiet for several minutes, considering everything he had told her. "Your plan has merit," she finally said, "but it's also incredibly dangerous. If you're caught on Hartwell's property, they'll kill you immediately. If Amara is caught trying to escape again, they'll make her death slow in public to discourage other attempts." "I know," Jake said, "but doing nothing guarantees she'll suffer or die anyway. At least this way she has a chance." Rebecca walked over to a stone bench in her garden and sat down, gesturing for Jake to join her. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. "Your reputation suggests you care more about money than human life." Jake thought about how to answer that question honestly. "You're right about my past," he said finally. "I've done things I'm ashamed of. I've hurt people who didn't deserve it, and I've put money ahead of doing what's right more times than I can count." "Then what's different now?" "I watched them whip her," Jake said quietly. "Twice, and both times she never made a sound. She took that pain without giving them the satisfaction of hearing her cry. It reminded me of my sister, who died while I was off making trouble instead of taking care of her." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I see. And you think saving this woman will somehow make up for not saving your sister?" "Maybe," Jake admitted. "Or maybe I just can't stand to watch another good person suffer when I have the power to help." They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the city around them. Finally, Rebecca spoke again. "I'll help you," she said, "but I have conditions. First, if you're caught, you never mention my name. I have other people depending on me, and I won't see them endangered by your choices." "Agreed," Jake said immediately. "Second, you follow my instructions exactly. I've been doing this work for 5 years, and I'm still alive because I'm careful. We do this my way, or we don't do it at all." "Yes, ma'am." "Third, once this is over, you disappear. Whether you succeed or fail, I never want to see you in Charleston again. Is that understood?" Jake nodded. "What do you need from me?" Rebecca stood up and smoothed her skirts. Come back tomorrow night after 10 o'clock. Use the servants' entrance at the back of the house. I'll have maps, supplies, and information about safe houses along your escape route. As Jake prepared to leave, Rebecca called out to him one more time. Mr. Morrison? The woman you're trying to save, what's her name? Amara, Jake replied. Tell me, Jake. What makes you think she'll trust you enough to risk her life following a stranger into the swamps? It was a question Jake had been asking himself for days. I don't know if she will, he admitted. I guess I'll find out when the time comes. As Jake climbed back over the garden wall, he felt a mixture of hope and terror. He finally had an ally, but the real danger was just beginning. In 1 week, he would either save Amara's life or get them both killed trying. The day of the Harvest Festival dawned bright and clear. Jake had spent the entire week preparing for this moment, studying the maps Rebecca had given him, and practicing his disguise as a horse trader. He had borrowed clothes from Rebecca's stable master, and learned enough about horses to sound convincing in casual conversation. Now, as he rode toward Hartwell's plantation in a borrowed wagon loaded with saddles and bridles, Jake felt his heart pounding against his ribs. Everything depended on the next few hours. If his disguise was discovered, if someone recognized him from a wanted poster, if any part of his plan went wrong, both he and Amara would pay with their lives. The plantation was bustling with activity when Jake arrived. Carriages lined the circular driveway in front of the big house, and well-dressed families strolled across the manicured lawns. Children ran between the adults playing games while their parents socialized and discussed business. Jake had to force himself not to think too hard about what these people were celebrating. To them, this was just a pleasant social gathering. They saw the elaborate decorations, the tables laden with food, and the entertainment provided by enslaved people who were forced to sing and dance for their amusement. They didn't see the suffering that made their comfortable lives possible. You must be the horse trader Rebecca mentioned, said a voice behind Jake as he unloaded his wagon. Jake turned to see a middle-aged man in an expensive suit approaching. This was Thomas Waverly, one of Hartwell's business partners and a frequent visitor to the plantation. Rebecca had warned Jake that Waverly might approach him, since she had used her social connections to arrange Jake's invitation to the festival. Yes, sir, Jake replied, touching the brim of his hat. Name's John Parker. Mrs. Thornfield said you folks might be interested in some quality tack. Indeed we are, Waverly said, examining one of Jake's saddles. Hartwell's been looking for new equipment for his stable. I'm sure he'll want to speak with you before the evening's over. Jake nodded and continued setting up his display, trying to look like any other traveling merchant. Around him, the festival continued with music, dancing, and elaborate meals served on fine china. The contrast between the luxury enjoyed by the white families and the conditions of the enslaved people serving them was stark and disturbing. As the afternoon wore on, Jake watched for his opportunity to slip away from the main festivities. The plantation's security was indeed lighter than usual, with most of the guards focused on managing the large crowd of visitors. The overseers were drinking and socializing instead of watching the slave quarters with their usual intensity. Just after sunset, when the main crowd was gathered around a makeshift stage watching a forced performance, Jake made his move. He slipped away from his wagon and walked casually toward the slave quarters, as if he were just taking a stroll to stretch his legs. The quarters consisted of a row of small wooden buildings that housed the plantation's enslaved population. Jake had studied the layout carefully through his telescope, and he knew that Amara was assigned to the third building from the left. The challenge would be getting inside without being seen by the other residents, who might raise an alarm if they thought he was a threat. Jake approached the building carefully, listening for sounds from inside. He could hear quiet conversations and the movements of people settling in for the night. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly on the door. "Who's there?" came a woman's voice from inside. "I'm looking for Amara," Jake whispered. "I'm here to help." There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. When it opened, Jake found himself face to face with the woman he had been thinking about for over a week. Even in the dim light, Jake could see that Amara had been through additional hardships since the auction. Her face was thinner and fresh bruises marked her arms and neck, but her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence and dignity that had first caught his attention. "Who are you?" she asked quietly, stepping outside and closing the door behind her to avoid disturbing the others. "My name is Jake Morrison," he replied. "I was at the auction when they sold you to Hartwell. I've been planning a way to get you out of here." Amara studied his face in the moonlight, clearly trying to decide whether to trust him. Why would you risk your life for someone you don't know? It was the same question Rebecca had asked, and Jake still didn't have a perfect answer. "Because what they're doing to you is wrong," he said simply. "And because I think you deserve a chance at freedom." "Even if I wanted to trust you," Amara said, "where could we go? Hartwell has friends everywhere, and slave catchers know these woods better than anyone." Jake pulled out the map Rebecca had given him, showing her the route they would take through the swamplands to reach the first safe house. "I have help from people who know how to get you to the Free States," he explained. "It won't be easy, but it's possible." Amara listened as Jake outlined the escape plan. They would leave during the festival's late-night dancing, when the guards would be most distracted. The route would take them through dangerous swampland, but it would also be the last place anyone would think to look for them. "I need to tell you something," Amara said when Jake finished explaining. "I'm not just any escaped slave. My father is Reverend David Washington, a prominent minister in Philadelphia. I was kidnapped from our home and brought here illegally. If I can get back to Pennsylvania, I have family and friends who can help expose this entire operation." This information changed everything. Jake had thought he was just saving one person, but Amara's freedom could potentially help many others. If her story became public, it might bring attention to the illegal kidnapping of free black people and the corruption that allowed it to happen. "That makes getting you out of here even more important," Jake said. "But it also makes it more dangerous. If Hartwell finds out who you really are, he'll never let you live to tell your story." "I know the risks," Amara replied. "But I also know that I'd rather die trying to escape than live the rest of my life as someone's property." They spent the next hour going over the details of the escape plan. Amara proved to be an intelligent planning partner, asking good questions and suggesting improvements to Jake's original ideas. She had been observing the plantation's routines carefully and knew things about the guards' patterns that Jake had missed. "There's something else you should know," Amara said as they prepared to part ways. "I've tried to escape twice before. The first time was right after they brought me here, and the second time was just before they branded me. I know the local terrain and I know what mistakes to avoid." "What happened during those attempts?" Jake asked. "The first time I made it about 10 miles before the dogs caught my scent," Amara explained. "The second time, I was betrayed by someone I thought I could trust. That's why I'm being careful about trusting you now." Jake understood her caution. "What can I do to prove that I'm serious about helping you?" Amara was quiet for a moment, considering his question. "Come back tomorrow night," she finally said. "If you're still here then, and if your story doesn't change, then maybe I'll believe you're real." "I'll be here," Jake promised. As they prepared to separate, Amara grabbed Jake's arm. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked again. "And don't give me some noble speech about doing what's right. People don't risk their lives for strangers without a deeper reason." Jake looked into her eyes and decided to tell her the truth. "Because watching them hurt you reminded me of my sister. She died while I was off making trouble instead of being there to protect her. Maybe I can't save Catherine, but I can try to save you." Amara nodded slowly. "I understand. I had a younger brother who was sold away from our family when I was a child. Sometimes helping others is the only way to heal our own pain." As Jake made his way back to the festival, he felt a mixture of hope and terror. Amara was even stronger and more resourceful than he had imagined, which gave their escape plan a better chance of success. But she was also more important than he had realized, which meant the consequences of failure would be even more terrible. The next 24 hours would determine whether Jake's promise to his dead sister would finally be kept, or whether his latest attempt at redemption would end in tragedy for everyone involved. The storm clouds had been building all evening, and by midnight rain was falling in heavy sheets across the plantation. Jake couldn't have asked for better weather. The downpour would wash away their scent, making it harder for tracking dogs to follow their trail. The thunder would mask any sounds they made during their escape. Jake had spent the day making final preparations. He had positioned supplies at strategic points along their escape route, disabled 2 of the plantation's hunting dogs by feeding them drugged meat, and studied the guards' routines one last time. Everything had to go perfectly, because they would only get one chance. At exactly midnight, Jake slipped away from the main house where the festival's late-night celebration was still continuing. Most of the guests were drunk on wine and whiskey, making it easy for him to disappear without being noticed. The few guards who were still at their posts were huddled under whatever shelter they could find, trying to stay dry. Jake made his way to the slave quarters through the darkness, using the lightning flashes to navigate when the rain became too heavy to see clearly. When he reached Amara's building, he found her waiting just inside the door, fully dressed and ready to go. "Are you sure about this?" Jake whispered as she stepped out into the storm. "I've been sure since the day they dragged me onto that auction block," Amara replied. "Let's go." They moved quickly but carefully through the plantation grounds, staying close to buildings and using the darkness as cover. Jake led the way toward the back fence line, where he had cut a hole in the wire earlier that evening. The rain was so heavy that they were both soaked to the skin within minutes, but it also meant that anyone looking out from the buildings would have trouble seeing them. The first part of their journey took them through cotton fields that had been recently harvested. The ground was muddy and difficult to walk on, but it also meant their footprints would be washed away quickly. Jake had chosen this route specifically because it led directly to the edge of the swampland, where they would be hardest to track. "How far to the first safe point?" Amara asked as they reached the edge of the fields. "About 2 miles through the swamp," Jake replied. "There's an old hunting cabin where we can rest and change into dry clothes." The swampland was treacherous even in good weather. In the middle of a thunderstorm, it became a nightmare of deep water, hidden roots, and dangerous animals. Jake had scouted this route carefully during the past week, marking safe paths through the worst areas, but navigating in the dark with rain blocking their vision was still extremely difficult. Amara proved to be an excellent traveling companion. She moved quietly and efficiently, never complaining about the difficult conditions. When Jake slipped and fell into a deep pool of muddy water, she helped pull him out without hesitation. When they had to cross a fallen log over a creek swollen by the rain, she went first to test whether it would hold their weight. "You've done this before," Jake observed, as they paused to rest under a large cypress tree. "Not exactly," Amara replied, "but I grew up near woods and streams in Pennsylvania. My father used to take me fishing and hunting when I was a child. He said every person should know how to survive in the wilderness." "Smart man," Jake said. "Those skills might save our lives tonight." They had been traveling for about an hour when they encountered their first serious problem. The rain had caused a normally shallow creek to flood, turning it into a raging river that blocked their path completely. Jake's carefully planned route was useless if they couldn't cross the water. "We could go around," Jake suggested, studying the swollen creek. "But it would add several miles to our journey, and we need to reach the first safe house before dawn." Amara studied the rushing water carefully. "There," she said, pointing to a spot about 50 yards upstream. "See where that big tree fell across the creek? If we can reach it, we might be able to use it as a bridge." Getting to the fallen tree meant wading through waist-deep water and fighting against a strong current. It was dangerous, but it was also their best option. Jake went first, using a long stick to test the depth and stability of the creek bottom. Amara followed, holding onto a rope Jake had tied around his waist. The crossing was terrifying. The current was stronger than it looked, and several times Jake felt his feet swept out from under him. Amara had to grab onto submerged branches to keep from being carried downstream. But finally they reached the fallen tree, and were able to climb across to the other side. 2 miles down, about 8 to go, Jake said as they caught their breath on the far bank. Their progress was slower than Jake had hoped, but they were making steady headway toward the safe house. The rain continued to fall heavily, which was both good and bad. Good because it covered their tracks, bad because it made every step dangerous and exhausting. It was around 3 in the morning when they heard the sound that filled them both with dread, the baying of hunting dogs in the distance. "They've discovered you're missing," Jake said, pulling out his pocket watch to check the time. "Sooner than I expected," Amara replied grimly. "Hartwell must have decided to check on the quarters early. The sound of the dogs was still far away, but it was definitely getting closer. Jake had hoped they would have at least until dawn before anyone noticed Amara's absence. Now they were in a race against time, with professional slave catchers and their trained hunting dogs pursuing them through terrain that favored the hunters. "We need to move faster," Jake said. But even as he spoke, he realized the problem. Moving faster in the dark swampland meant taking bigger risks. One serious injury could end their escape attempt immediately. That's when Amara surprised him again. She pulled a small cloth bag from her dress and showed Jake its contents. Various herbs and plants she had been collecting secretly during her time on the plantation. "Some of these can mask our scent," she explained. "Others can make the dogs sick if they get close enough to sniff them. My grandmother taught me about plants before she died." Working quickly, Amara crushed some of the herbs and rubbed them on their clothes and shoes. Others she scattered along their back trail, creating a confusing mix of scents that might throw off the hunting dogs. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it might buy them precious extra time. They pressed on through the swamp, pushing themselves harder despite the dangerous conditions. Behind them, the sound of dogs and shouting men grew steadily closer. Jake estimated they had maybe an hour before their pursuers would catch up. "There," Jake said finally, pointing through the rain to a small structure barely visible among the trees. The hunting cabin. The cabin was old and abandoned, but it was dry and secure. More importantly, Jake had hidden supplies there earlier. In the week, dry clothes, food, medical supplies, and weapons. They would need all of these things for the next part of their journey. As they approached the cabin, Jake suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. Something was wrong. The door was standing open, and he could see light flickering inside. "Someone's in there," Amara whispered. Jake drew his pistol and motioned for Amara to stay behind him. Slowly, they crept closer to the cabin. Through the open door, Jake could see 3 men sitting around a small fire. They were armed and alert, clearly waiting for something. Or someone. "It's a trap," Jake realized with a sinking heart. Someone must have told them about our escape route. The sound of dogs was getting closer by the minute. They couldn't go forward to the cabin, and they couldn't go back the way they came. They were trapped in the middle of a swamp with nowhere to run. "This way," Amara said suddenly, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him toward a thick grove of trees. "I saw another path when we were crossing the creek. It's not on your map, but it might lead us around the cabin." As they melted back into the darkness, Jake realized that their carefully planned escape had just become a desperate fight for survival. The hunters were closing in from behind, enemies were waiting ahead, and dawn was still hours away. But looking at Amara's determined face in the lightning flashes, Jake felt his resolve strengthen. They had come too far to give up now. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The abandoned mill sat in a clearing about 5 miles from the hunting cabin, exactly where Rebecca's map had indicated. Jake and Amara had spent 4 grueling hours working their way through alternate swamp routes, avoiding both the men waiting at the cabin and the hunting party that was still tracking them through the night. Jake felt a surge of relief when he saw the old wooden building rising from the mist. According to Rebecca's instructions, this was supposed to be their first major safe house, where Underground Railroad conductors would be waiting to help them reach the next stage of their journey to freedom. "Finally," Jake whispered, as they approached the mill through the gray pre-dawn light. "We can rest here and get help for the next part of the route." But as they got closer to the building, Jake began to notice things that didn't seem right. There were too many horses tied up outside for a simple safe house operation. Light was coming from multiple windows, suggesting more people inside than there should be. Most troubling of all, Jake could see the shapes of armed men positioned around the building. "Something's wrong," Amara said, echoing Jake's own growing concern. They crept closer, using the morning mist as cover. Through one of the windows, Jake could see inside the mill, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Rebecca Thornfield was sitting in a chair in the center of the room, her hands tied behind her back and blood running from a cut on her forehead. Standing over her was Silas Hartwell himself, along with at least a dozen armed men. Some Jake recognized as plantation overseers. Others looked like professional slave catchers and bounty hunters. "This is impossible," Jake muttered. "How did they know to come here?" The answer came when Hartwell began speaking in a voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls of the old mill. "I have to admit, Mrs. Thornfield, your little Underground Railroad operation was quite clever," Hartwell was saying. It took me months to figure out how you were moving slaves through my territory without being caught. Rebecca's voice was weak, but defiant when she replied. You'll never stop all of us. For every route you discover, we'll find 2 more. Hartwell laughed, a cold sound that made Jake's skin crawl. Oh, I don't need to stop all of you. I just needed to stop you. You were the heart of the operation in this region. Without your money and connections, the whole network will collapse. How? Rebecca asked. How did you find out about this place? Simple, Hartwell replied. I've been watching you for months, waiting for the right opportunity. When your friend Morrison came to visit you, I knew something big was being planned, so I had my people follow him during his scouting trips. Every location he visited, every route he mapped out, I knew about all of it. Jake felt sick to his stomach. His careful planning had been turned against them. Every precaution he had taken, every secret meeting with Rebecca had been observed and reported back to their enemies. Where are they now? One of Hartwell's men asked. They'll be here soon, Hartwell replied confidently. Morrison thinks this is a safe house. He has no idea he's walking into a trap. When they arrive, we'll take them alive. I want to make very public examples of what happens to people who steal my property. Amara touched Jake's arm and motioned for him to follow her away from the window. When they were far enough from the mill to speak safely, she whispered urgently, We have to help her. It's suicide, Jake replied, though he was thinking the same thing. There are at least 12 armed men in there, and we have 1 pistol and a knife. We can't just leave her, Amara insisted. She risked everything to help us. If we run away now, they'll torture her to death trying to get information about other underground railroad operations. Jake knew Amara was right, but he also knew that charging into that mill would almost certainly get all 3 of them killed. He tried to think of alternatives, but their options were extremely limited. Even if we could somehow get inside, Jake said, how would we get Rebecca out? She's injured and tied up, and we'd have to fight our way through a dozen men to reach her. There might be another way, Amara said, studying the layout of the mill complex. Look, there's a water wheel on the side of the building. If I could climb up there and get onto the roof, I might be able to create a distraction while you attack from the front. Absolutely not, Jake said firmly. I'm not putting you in more danger. You should run now, while you still have a chance. Head north toward the river and try to find another underground railroad contact. I'm not leaving either of you, Amara replied with the same stubborn courage Jake had first noticed at the auction block. We do this together or we don't do it at all. Jake realized there was no point in arguing with her. They were running out of time anyway. He could hear the sound of dogs getting closer as Hartwell's hunting party followed their trail toward the mill. All right, Jake said, making a decision that felt like signing their death warrants. But we do this my way. I go in the front and try to draw their attention. You circle around and see if you can free Rebecca through a back window. Once she's loose, all 3 of us run for the swamp and hope we can lose them in the marsh. What about weapons? Amara asked. Jake handed her his knife and checked his pistol one more time. 6 bullets against 12 men. Not good odds, but better than nothing. They split up with Amara circling around toward the back of the mill while Jake approached the front entrance. His plan was simple and desperate. Create as much chaos as possible and hope that Amara could get Rebecca out during the confusion. Jake took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and kicked open the front door of the mill. Let her go, Hartwell, he shouted, pointing his pistol at the plantation owner. The reaction was immediate and violent. Men dove for cover behind machinery and wooden beams, drawing their own weapons as they moved. Jake managed to get off 3 shots before the return fire forced him to take cover behind an overturned table. Jake Morrison, Hartwell called out, sounding pleased rather than concerned. So good of you to join us. I was beginning to think you had lost your nerve. I said let her go, Jake shouted back, trying to keep everyone's attention focused on him rather than looking for Amara. I don't think so, Hartwell replied. You're going to come out from behind that table with your hands up, or I'm going to start cutting pieces off your friend here. Jake could hear Rebecca's voice, weak but still defiant. Don't do it, Jake. Get Amara out of here while you still can. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jake. There was a loud crash from the back of the mill, followed by shouting and confusion. Amara had apparently found a way inside and was creating the distraction they needed. Jake used the confusion to his advantage, moving from cover and firing his remaining bullets at Hartwell's men. He managed to wound 2 of them before his gun clicked empty. But there were still too many enemies and not enough cover. That's when he saw Amara. She had somehow gotten Rebecca's hands free and was helping the injured woman toward a broken window at the back of the mill. But one of Hartwell's men had spotted them and was raising his rifle to shoot. Without thinking, Jake threw himself across the room, tackling the gunman just as he fired. The bullet went wide, but Jake's heroic move left him exposed to the other armed men in the room. "Got you," one of them shouted, pointing his pistol at Jake's head. But before he could pull the trigger, Amara appeared behind him with a heavy piece of mill machinery in her hands. The man went down hard, but the noise brought two more enemies running toward them. "This way," Rebecca called out despite her injuries. She had found a hidden passage that led from the mill toward the swamp. One final secret that might save their lives. The three of them fought their way toward the passage as bullets flew around them. Jake was bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. Rebecca could barely stand, and Amara was exhausted from their long night of running. But somehow they made it to the hidden exit just as Hartwell's reinforcements arrived at the mill. They escaped into the swamp just as the sun was rising, but Jake knew their troubles were far from over. They were all injured, they had no supplies, and Hartwell's men would be following them within minutes. Worse still, Rebecca's underground railroad network had been compromised. Even if they survived the next few hours, they would be on their own in hostile territory with nowhere safe to run. The swamp seemed different in daylight, more dangerous and less forgiving than it had been during their midnight escape. Jake's shoulder wound was bleeding steadily, soaking through the makeshift bandage Amara had torn from her dress. Rebecca was barely conscious, her head injury worse than they had initially realized. Every step was agony, but they couldn't stop moving. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Hartwell's men had recovered from the surprise attack at the mill, and were now tracking them with professional determination. The morning sun was burning off the protective mist, making it easier for their enemies to follow their trail through the muddy swampland. "We need to find shelter," Amara said, supporting Rebecca's weight as they struggled through knee-deep water. "Rebecca needs medical attention, and Jake, you're losing too much blood." Jake knew she was right, but he also knew they couldn't afford to stop. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles ahead," he said, consulting the map Rebecca had given him days earlier. "If we can reach it, maybe we can hold them off long enough to figure out our next move." "And if we can't reach it?" Amara asked. Jake didn't answer because they all knew what would happen if Hartwell's men caught them. Rebecca would be tortured for information about other underground railroad operations. Amara would be dragged back to the plantation for a public execution designed to terrorize other slaves. And Jake would be hanged as an example to anyone else who might think about helping escaped slaves. They pressed on through the swamp, moving as quickly as Rebecca's condition would allow. The elderly woman was remarkably tough, refusing to complain despite her obvious pain. But Jake could see that she was fading fast. The blow to her head had been severe, and she needed proper medical care that they couldn't provide in the middle of a swamp. "Tell me about your father," Jake said to Amara, trying to keep everyone's spirits up during the difficult journey. "What's he like?" Amara's face softened as she thought about her family. "He's the strongest man I know," she replied. "Not physically strong, he's actually quite small. But he has this way of making people believe they can overcome anything. He's helped hundreds of people find courage when they thought they had none left." "He sounds like a good man," Rebecca said weakly. "He is," Amara confirmed. "He taught me that freedom isn't just about being able to go where you want or do what you want. Real freedom is about being able to choose who you become, regardless of what circumstances try to force on you." Jake thought about those words as they continued their slow progress through the swamp. He had spent most of his life thinking that freedom meant having no responsibilities, no ties to other people, no reason to stay in one place. But watching Amara and Rebecca risk everything for each other was teaching him a different lesson about what freedom really meant. They had been traveling for about an hour when Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. The baying of hunting dogs, much closer than before. "They're gaining on us," he said, checking his weapons. He had managed to take 2 pistols from Hartwell's men during the fight at the mill, but ammunition was limited. "How much farther to the cabin?" Amara asked. "Maybe half a mile," Jake replied. "But at this pace, they'll catch us before we get there." That's when Rebecca made a decision that surprised them both. "Leave me here," she said, stopping in the middle of a small clearing. I'm slowing you down and I'm not going to make it much farther anyway. We're not abandoning you, Amara said firmly. You're not abandoning me, Rebecca replied. You're accepting a tactical reality. I'm injured and exhausted. You two still have a chance to escape if you don't have to carry me. Jake understood what Rebecca was really saying. She was offering to sacrifice herself to give them a better chance at freedom. It was the same kind of courage that had led her to risk her fortune and reputation helping escaped slaves. There has to be another way, Jake said, but even as he spoke, he could hear the dogs getting closer. There is, Rebecca said. Take my weapons and ammunition. Find high ground where you can make a stand. Force them to come at you from a predictable direction, where your superior position gives you an advantage. What about you? Amara asked. Rebecca smiled weakly. I'm going to do what I can to slow them down. Maybe I can convince them that you went in a different direction. At the very least, I can buy you some time. Jake realized that Rebecca was right about the tactical situation, but everything inside him rebelled against the idea of leaving her behind. It felt too much like abandoning his sister Catherine all over again. I can't do it, he said. I can't leave another person behind to save myself. You're not saving yourself, Rebecca replied. You're saving her. She nodded toward Amara. Her story needs to reach the outside world. People need to know what's happening here. The kidnapping of free citizens, the corruption of local officials, the systematic brutality of slavery. If she dies in this swamp, that story dies with her. Amara looked torn between her desire to escape and her unwillingness to abandon the woman who had risked everything to help them. Maybe we could all hide until they pass by, she suggested. With tracking dogs? Rebecca shook her head. They'll find us no matter where we hide. This is our only chance. The sound of approaching voices decided the matter. Hartwell's men were close enough now that they could hear individual conversations. In a few more minutes, they would be in sight. Go, Rebecca said, pressing her pistol into Jake's hands. Follow the creek north until you reach the big oak tree with the broken top. There's a deer trail that leads to higher ground. Make your stand there. Jake wanted to argue more, but he could see the wisdom in Rebecca's plan. A fighting retreat to defensible terrain was their best chance of survival. Staying together in the open swamp would just get all three of them killed or captured. Thank you, Amara said, hugging Rebecca quickly. I'll make sure your sacrifice means something. Just get to Philadelphia, Rebecca replied. Tell your father's congregation what you've seen here. Make sure the world knows the truth. Jake and Amara left Rebecca sitting by a fallen log, trying to make herself comfortable for what might be her final moments. As they hurried toward the creek, Jake felt the familiar weight of guilt and responsibility settling on his shoulders. But this time, he wasn't running away from his obligations. This time he was running toward them. Rebecca had given them a chance, and he was going to make sure that chance wasn't wasted. The creek led them through increasingly rocky terrain as they moved north. Behind them, they could hear shouting as Hartwell's men found Rebecca. Jake hoped she would be able to buy them the time they needed, but he also knew that her interrogation would be brutal. There, Amara said, pointing to a large oak tree with a storm-damaged top. That must be the landmark Rebecca mentioned. The deer trail was barely visible, but it led up a steep hillside toward what looked like defensible terrain. Jake could see rock formations that would provide cover and commanding views of the approaches from below. As they climbed toward their chosen battle position, Jake realized that this might be where their journey ended. They had escaped the plantation, survived the night in the swamp, and rescued Rebecca from Hartwell's trap. But now they were injured, outnumbered, and running out of places to run. Still, looking at Amara's determined face as she helped him up the rocky slope, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pride in what they had accomplished together. Whatever happened next, they had proven that courage and determination could triumph over overwhelming odds. At least for a while. 3 weeks of running through wilderness had taken its toll on both of them. Jake's shoulder wound had healed badly without proper medical care, leaving him with limited use of his left arm. Amara had developed a persistent cough from sleeping in cold, damp conditions night after night. But somehow they had managed to stay ahead of their pursuers and work their way steadily northward. The confrontation at the rocky hilltop had gone better than Jake had dared to hope. Using the terrain to their advantage, they had managed to hold off Hartwell's men long enough for a summer thunderstorm to wash away their tracks and confuse the hunting dogs. In the chaos of the storm and gunfight, They had slipped away and begun the long journey toward the Ohio River. Now, standing on the muddy banks of that river in the gray dawn light, Jake could hardly believe they had made it this far. The Ohio River represented the boundary between slavery and freedom, the line between the South, where Amara was considered property, and the North, where she would be recognized as a human being with rights. But Jake's condition was worse than he had admitted to Amara. The infection in his shoulder had spread, and he was running a high fever. He had been hiding his weakness for days, but now he could barely stand without support. "There's the ferry landing," Amara said, pointing to a small dock about a quarter-mile downstream. "But I don't see any boats." Jake squinted through his fever-blurred vision and made out the shape of a small building near the dock. Smoke was rising from its chimney, suggesting someone was inside. According to the information Rebecca had given them weeks ago, the ferryman was a Quaker named Samuel Wright who secretly helped escaped slaves cross to freedom. "We need to be careful," Jake said, swaying slightly as another wave of dizziness hit him. "Hartwell's people might have gotten here ahead of us." But even as he spoke, Jake knew they didn't have much choice. His condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Amara couldn't carry him much farther. If they were going to make it across the river, it had to be now. They approached the ferry landing cautiously, using the morning mist as cover. The small building turned out to be a combination office and living quarters for the ferryman. Through one of the windows, they could see an elderly man with a gray beard preparing breakfast over a wood stove. Jake was about to call out when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking back along the river road, he could see a group of riders emerging from the tree line. Even at a distance, he recognized Silas Hartwell's distinctive silhouette. "He found us," Amara said, her voice tight with exhaustion and despair. Jake counted at least 8 men in Hartwell's party. They were still about half a mile away, but they would reach the ferry landing within minutes. There was nowhere left to run. The river blocked their path north, and open farmland stretched for miles in every other direction. "Get behind me," Jake said, drawing his pistol and checking the ammunition. He had 3 bullets left, not nearly enough to fight off 8 armed men, but maybe enough to buy Amara time to escape. "I'm not hiding behind you," Amara replied, picking up a fallen tree branch that could serve as a club. "We've come this far together. We face whatever comes next together." The ferryman must have heard their voices because he stepped out of his building and looked in their direction. Samuel Wright was a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands. He took one look at Jake and Amara, then glanced at the approaching riders and seemed to understand the situation immediately. "This way," he called softly, motioning them toward his boat. "Quickly now." "They'll kill you for helping us," Jake warned as they hurried toward the small ferry. "Then they'll have to answer to the Lord for it," Samuel replied calmly. "Get in the boat." The ferry was really just a large rowboat with a flat bottom, designed to carry passengers and cargo across the narrow river. It could hold maybe 6 people comfortably, but it wasn't built for speed or defense. If Hartwell's men reached the dock before they got across, they would be sitting ducks on the open water. Jake collapsed onto one of the boat's wooden benches as Samuel began untying the mooring ropes. His fever was getting worse and black spots were dancing at the edges of his vision. He could hear Amara talking to him, but her voice seemed to be coming from very far away. "Hold on, Jake," she was saying. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." The boat pushed off from the dock just as Hartwell's men came thundering into the ferry landing. Silas Hartwell himself was leading the group, his face twisted with rage at seeing his property escaping across the water. "Stop that boat," Hartwell shouted, raising his rifle. "Stop or I'll shoot." Samuel Wright continued rowing steadily toward the far shore, his expression calm despite the threats being shouted behind them. "He won't shoot," the ferryman said quietly. "A dead slave girl is worth nothing to him." But Jake could see that Hartwell's calculations were more complex than simple profit and loss. The plantation owner had spent weeks and significant resources hunting them down. This had become personal for him, a matter of pride and reputation that went beyond money. "Actually," Jake said weakly, "I think he might." As if to prove Jake's point, Hartwell raised his rifle and fired a warning shot that splashed into the water near their boat. "Next shot won't be a warning," Hartwell called across the water. They were about halfway across the river now, still within rifle range but getting farther away, with each stroke of Samuel's oars. The far shore represented freedom, but it might as well have been on the moon if they couldn't reach it alive. That's when Amara stood up in the boat, making herself a clear target for Hartwell's rifle. "What are you doing?" Jake tried to say, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Mr. Hartwell," Amara called across the water, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "If you want me back, you'll have to shoot me right here. But a dead slave can't work your fields or bear children to increase your labor force." Jake watched in amazement as Amara faced down the most dangerous man in 3 counties. She stood straight and proud in the middle of the boat, showing the same courage she had displayed on the auction block weeks ago. "You think I won't do it?" Hartwell shouted back, raising his rifle to his shoulder. "I think you're a businessman before you're a killer," Amara replied. "And I think you know that murdering a woman in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, would bring you more trouble than any escaped slave is worth." The tension stretched across the water like a physical thing. Jake could see Hartwell's finger on the trigger of his rifle, could see the calculation going on behind the man's cold eyes. For a moment it seemed like the plantation owner might pull the trigger anyway, just to make a point about what happened to his property. But then Samuel Wright's voice cut through the silence. "This woman is under my protection now," the ferryman called out. "And this boat is in free waters. If you fire that weapon, you'll be committing murder in the state of Ohio, where slavery has no legal standing." Hartwell hesitated, looking around at his men as if seeking advice. Jake could see the conflict on the plantation owner's face, his desire for revenge warring with his understanding of the legal and political consequences of his actions. Finally, Hartwell lowered his rifle with obvious reluctance. "This isn't over," he called across the water. "I have friends in Ohio. I'll find you, and when I do, you'll wish you had never run from me." But his words carried no real threat now. Once they reached the Ohio shore, Amara would be in free territory surrounded by people who didn't recognize Hartwell's claims of ownership. The plantation owner could rant and threaten all he wanted, but his power ended at the water's edge. Samuel Wright's boat scraped against the wooden dock on the Ohio side of the river, just as Jake's strength finally gave out completely. He collapsed in the bottom of the boat, his fever finally overwhelming his determination to stay conscious. The last thing he remembered clearly was Amara's voice calling for help, and the sound of footsteps running toward them along the dock. When Jake woke up 3 days later, he was lying in a clean bed in what appeared to be a Quaker meeting house. Sunlight was streaming through tall windows, and he could hear voices talking quietly in another room. His fever had broken, and for the first time in weeks he wasn't in pain. "You're awake," Amara said, appearing in the doorway with a bowl of soup in her hands. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," Jake replied, his voice hoarse but clear. "But alive." "Where are we?" "Portsmouth, Ohio," Amara said, setting the soup on a bedside table. "Samuel Wright brought us here after you collapsed. The Quakers have been taking care of you while I sent word to my father in Philadelphia." Jake tried to sit up and found that his strength was slowly returning. "What about Hartwell? Is he still looking for us?" "He left 2 days ago," Amara said. "Apparently, the local sheriff made it clear that slave catchers weren't welcome in his county. Hartwell's threats don't carry much weight this far north." Over the next few days, as Jake recovered his strength, he learned what had happened during his illness. Amara had indeed sent word to her father, Reverend David Washington, who was traveling from Philadelphia to collect her. More importantly, she had also contacted newspaper reporters and abolition societies, preparing to tell her story to the world.